Okay, so I'll talk now a little bit about what forensic psychology actually is. In its broadest definition, it's applying psychology to the legal system. So as we'll go on to see, there's very many different ways in which it can be applied, whether it's rehabilitation in prisons, or whether it's assessing competency during trials, or whether it's aiding in police investigations. So it's a very, very broad field. And the hope is in this course, we'll cover enough topics that you get an idea of how broad it is, and also that you'll definitely cover some topics that you're really interested in, hopefully. And maybe if you want to pursue forensic psychology afterwards, you'll have an idea of what you want to most focus on. I'm going to hopefully clear up some misconceptions that maybe some people have over forensic psychology. Because in the media, probably the first thing maybe people think of is criminal profiling. Criminal Minds has a large impact on what people think about when it comes to forensic psychology. It's not quite as glamorous and as mystical as it sometimes appears in movies and in television, right? In Criminal Minds and Silence of the Lambs, they make amazing deductions based upon very little information. In real life, profiling is only a very small part of what a forensic psychologist does, but also the process itself is much more laborious and time consuming than it is portrayed to be. But also it's typically only something that aids in investigations. Profilers provide some advice. They never lead to the investigation. They're not actually making the arrests and so on, like you see in Criminal Minds. And we'll talk more about some misconceptions later in the course. Runaway Jury, if you've ever seen this movie, it's about forensic psychologists helping with reading the body language of juries, informing the lawyers on how they might tailor their approach. It's very, very elaborate. They're in some lab and there's multiple screens and they're doing background reports on all the jurors and so on. In reality, there's maybe a forensic psychologist sitting in the audience taking notes on a notepad. It's nowhere near as elaborate and glamorous as it is in the movie. So some misconceptions. First of all, this is not forensic science, okay? This is not CSI. I'm not going to tell you about blood splatter analysis or DNA testing or how to solve a crime using methods from forensic science. That's a completely different discipline. What we're doing in forensic psychology is applying psychological principles, psychological theories, and psychological research findings to the legal system, either to make sense of criminal behavior or to aid the legal system, either through rehabilitation or through helping with investigations or risk assessments. It is not forensic science or CSI. It's not quite as glamorous and sexy as it's often portrayed in the media. Most forensic psychologists work in prisons, and I can tell you that's anything but glamorous, okay? So it's not quite as it's often portrayed. It's very little to do with criminal profiling. A very small number of forensic psychologists will ever take part in criminal profiling. The field is much, much broader than this. And it's typically portrayed pretty inaccurately in films and in TV. Okay, so when I say it's applying psychology to the legal system, here's some domains in which we might apply psychological findings and theories. So for example, to law enforcement, perhaps to aid in police interrogations, telling them signs to watch out for in terms of suggestibility or what might lead to false confessions and what might be characterized as police misconduct. We could be helping the courts determine if someone is competent to stand trial, if they're competent enough to help in their own defense and they're in control of their faculties and so on, or if they meet the standard for insanity by the legal definition. So do they actually know what they're doing? Do they know what they did was wrong if they did something illegal? Do they understand consequences to their behavior? Evaluating eyewitness testimony, so perhaps eyewitnesses in a trial giving some evidence, some testimony, perhaps then giving some instructions to the jury, giving them some information on what factors impact memory. Then they can evaluates the eyewitness testimony themselves in light of the evidence that there is. We could work in the correctional system, helping with rehabilitation, so to prevent future crimes once offender is released, or to aid in the well-being. Release into the community, so making sure one is suitably prepared when they're released into the community, that there's protective factors in place so they're less likely to reoffend once they're released, so that they have a social support network, or that they have a job that will help them have regular income. And we could split psychology into that which is applied and then that which is more academic. So in terms of applied forensic psychology, it could be working in police psychology, perhaps helping the police in their recruitment. These are the traits that you might want to look out for in hiring that might be desirable. These might be traits that are less desirable. Perhaps counseling for post-traumatic stress disorder if a police officer is suffering or being involved in a police-related shooting. Helping investigations, perhaps in the form of profiling. Clinical assessments, so assessing one's level of risk. Is this individual in prison at a high risk of reoffending if they're released? Is that what the evidence points to? Or does the evidence point them to being at a lower risk of reoffending? In prison psychology, so applying clinical psychology in a prison setting, so some sort of therapeutic process that's aided to perhaps improve empathy or lessen anger, lessen aggression, but hopefully will in the future lessen chances of reoffending if the person is released. And it could also be evaluations for parole boards, which might influence if the person is given parole or not once they've listened to the forensic psychologist over how likely this person is to reoffend. Academic psychology could contribute to forensic psychology in multiple ways. Biological psychology could look at the heritability of criminality and the effects of injury. So, for example, the damage to the prefrontal cortex, does that make one more impulsive, less in control of themselves? Does it make them more likely to be aggressive when provoked? Developmental aggression, perhaps the development of aggression, the development of delinquency, perhaps how early childhood experiences may contribute to later aggression. Cognitive psychology could be understanding the memory and then applying that in a forensic setting. So this is what we know about memory. This is when it's impacted. For example, maybe one is overwhelmed by stress. They're less likely to remember certain details, and then giving that information in a court setting so people can evaluate eyewitness memory. Social psychology could look at the influence of the media on aggression and how juries talk to one another and come to their decisions, the impacts of group processes within that particular context. So just some examples of applied forensic psychology. It could be determinations of insanity, fitness to stand trial, and if one is competent to plead guilty, do they actually know what they're pleading to? Perhaps critical incident stress debriefings with police officers after some stressful events. Designing and conducting treatment programs with offenders, again, designed to lessen the chances of reoffending. So, for example, a forensic psychologist who perhaps works in a prison and works using applied forensic psychology, this could be their not typical day, because every day is slightly different, but one day. Early in the morning could be leading a session on a accredited sex offender treatment program with convicted sex offenders designed to lessen the chances they'll reoffend if released. And then perhaps doing some report writing on the progress of those taking part in that program. And perhaps then carrying out some individual risk assessment. Perhaps someone is up for parole and the forensic psychologist will evaluate at what level of risk they are in terms of reoffending, and then that report will be given to the parole board. And maybe in the afternoon, they'll be working on some research the research, if they're an applied forensic psychologist, will have the purpose of aiding and informing their work. So some testing of some treatment program perhaps, and seeing if it's going to be effective in reducing reoffending. And then they might be supervising trainee forensic psychologists, and so they might be going over some reports later in the afternoon written by a trainee or supervising in some way. Academic forensic psychology could look at factors that determine jury decision-making, how to best conduct an eyewitness lineup. So under these conditions, is it more likely that one will give an accurate identification, or is it under these conditions? The impact of questioning styles on memory recall. So is one more likely to remember something if asked an open-ended question or a close-ended or a leading question? Different risk assessment strategies, how well do they hold up? So doing some longitudinal study that follows up on offenders after they've been released. Did they reoffend? Did this risk assessment tool actually work in terms of predicting who would be more likely to reoffend and who would not? And perhaps examining the effect of stress management interventions on police. So if there's some stress management designed to lower stress, is it actually working? Again, a follow-up study that's measuring their future stress levels.